Well, good evening. I'm Tom Fenton, longtime foreign correspondent. I've spent some of my life in the Middle East, but I want to tell you right off the bat, I'm not an expert. I'm not an Arabic speaker. We have the panel here with an amazing amount of expertise on our subject, which is the future of the state media in the Arab world at this time of uprising or revolutions or whatever you want to call them, but this amazing change that is sweeping through North Africa and the Middle East. And to begin with, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have all the way to the right, Dina Mattar, Senior Lecturer in Arab Media and Political Communication at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Faisal Abbas, a London-based journalist, blogger, social commentator, who writes regularly for the Huffington Post, among others, but has also worked with more Arabic media. Hugh Miles, an award-winning investigative journalist, author of several books, including, most particularly, a definitive work on Al Jazeera, How Arab TV News Challenged the World. And all the way to the left, Ayman Moyeldin, did I pronounce it correctly?
Yep.
Thank you. Who is a Middle East-based correspondent for Al Jazeera English. And I will ask our four panelists just to kick off with a brief statement from each of them on what they see as the most important points of this change in the Middle East and how it affects the media.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Dina Mattar, as Tom said. I used to be a journalist. I worked in journalism for 18 years before becoming an academic. I think the topic is quite huge, and it's going to be very difficult to try and narrow it down and to talk about one element or an angle that we can concentrate on here. But in terms of the challenges, as the topic was presented to us, the challenges to state media, I think the changes would open questions about trust, about legitimacy, about the availability of diverse narratives, diverse stories, different voices, and how can the state media, we can put it between quotes, how can they manage to gain credibility or to gain trust, particularly that if they are still associated with the old guard. I think these are questions that will need time for us to find out what is happening. But at the moment, there are changes taking place in some of the countries that have experienced change, particularly Tunisia and Egypt. And the changes are quite, I think they're quite sincere and deep. In Egypt, we have seen a change in the editors at some of the state media, including Al Ahram. And we have seen a change in the language that is used by the old state media, which is now still under the same name, but perhaps under a new editorship. I think other key problems that face the state media and actually media in general in the Arab world is the question of ethics, questions of social responsibility, the question of what to write about, how to say things, and so on. And I think there is a need for some form of regulation. Now, we cannot talk about reforming or changing state media in the abstract, because I think media is part of political processes and part of the changes that are taking place in any society. So the institutions, they are institutions, so to speak, and they have been institutions of the state, and they have been used by states for propaganda purposes, let us say, if for want of use of a better word, and also for trying to get the people behind them, to get the people behind the states. And it is no secret that, particularly in one-party systems, like for instance Syria, that the state media does promote or does reflect the state view, and there is no space for diverse media. So I did mention, so all of these things need to be talked about, and they're part of the changes in the political scene. So we cannot think of media changing, and we cannot expect media to change overnight, which in some cases it has done, but the consequences might be even worse without changes in the political scene and in political institutions. And I think I'll leave the space for other people to speak, and then perhaps we can have more questions afterwards.
Faisal.
Yes, hi. My name is Faisal Abbas. I'm a blogger with the Huffington Post, which is an American blog. Before I used to work with a number of Arab media outlets, including Sharq al-Awsat, where I established their media supplement, which is a weekly supplement that tackled media. I also worked with Al-Hayat, Future Television, a number of other media outlets. It's been an interesting ride. It's very difficult to talk after an academic or professor. My reason for joining this debate is I just thought the question had a very simple answer. The question is, what's going to be the future of Arab state-owned media? And my answer is there's not going to be any future for Arab state media. And but I imagine my opening argument should have been a bit longer. So I'm going to dwell for a second on the reason why I don't think we're going to see much more of state-owned media. We've seen recent events in Egypt. We saw how a single Facebook page single-handedly took down the mighty, the long-established state-owned television and other media outlets such as the newspapers. I'm of course referring to the page that was established on Facebook. It's called Kulluna Khalid Saeed. In English, it means we are all Khalid Saeed, who we all know was a blogger who suffered an atrocity because of what he was posting against the state security forces. I'm not with the notion that this is what many people are referring to as a social media revolution or a Facebook revolution. I don't think it is. If you compare the internet usage in the Arab world, you find that it's 40 million Arabs used the internet last year, which is the equivalent of what Al Jazeera Arabic gets in one day. I think it's a mixture of both. And to cut a long story short, I think if competition doesn't take out the state-owned media, the dictators which use them will soon dismantle them because they've proven useless. And a very clear example is what happened with Al-Ahram last summer. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the infamous incident of photo doctoring, whereby conveniently the photo editor decided to remove Barack Obama from the beginning, from the lead of the Arab leaders, the leaders who attending the peace summit, and put Hosni Mubarak. And the atrocity is that the paper didn't even apologize. They justified it by saying this is an expressive picture. Another example of the uselessness of state-owned media would be the recent incidents in Tahrir Square, where Egyptian television was actually focusing on some parts of Tahrir Square which were less populated by protesters, when everybody else was watching Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya or on YouTube seeing the truth. So to cut a long story short, they're useless.
Good. You.
Good evening. Thank you very much to the Frontline for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here on this panel. My view of the state media in the Arab world is that certainly it has a lot of problems. It's suffering from two major problems. One is technical, which the media in the West is also suffering from, which is the rapid advances of the internet, and the way we consume media means that old models no longer make sense, and newspapers are going out of business, and obviously all these problems all are repeated in the Arab world. So they have technical problems staying up to date and competing, and they need money and trained staff to be able to do that. But they also have another problem, which is a crisis of credibility. They are completely discredited. For years, they've been trailing in popularity stakes against Al Jazeera in particular when it comes to news, but also other private commercial channels. So the state media in Egypt and Tunisia needs a complete overhaul, needs to reinvent itself, and it has a very large hill to climb in order to become competitive again. Because to be competitive, they need to have the same ingredients that Al Jazeera has, which is a backer with bottomless pockets, a political environment which will tolerate freedom of speech, and they need to be able to compete to attract the best staff, which Al Jazeera has been able to do, and also Al Jazeera benefited a lot from the aborted BBC Arabic project at the beginning. These are the requirements. This is what it takes to be competitive in the highly competitive Arab satellite market, and certainly state media is far from that point at the moment. Having said that, Egypt and Tunisia are still in a very revolutionary phase. The future is very uncertain. The media now is more important than ever because it's really the only thing that can hold the current interim government to account. They need our support, and going forward, we're going to need the media in Egypt to do a good job of holding people in power to account. So we have to hope that they manage to get back on their feet. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what the elections are going to bring, but hopefully it will be a more tolerant environment than the last one. Okay, thank you.
Ayman?
Thank you very much. My name is Ayman Mohiuddin. I'm the correspondent for Al Jazeera based in Cairo, Egypt. I've also had the privilege of covering a few other places in the region. It's a great honor and privilege to be here to speak at the Frontline Club, so thank you very much for the invitation and to be with such a distinguished panel. I really appreciate that. I'm actually one of perhaps because I'm a practitioner and a journalist, I feel maybe I'm a little bit biased because I do subscribe wholeheartedly to the notion that these revolutions were in fact powered by information, and I'm not a big fan of the marketing gimmick to call it Facebook revolution or Twitter revolution, but for any of you who've spent a little time here or in Egypt rather, they'll know that Egyptians have a quite keen sense of humor, so I thought maybe I could just share a quick joke about the information, if you will, that played a role in the revolution. It goes something like this, and if you've heard it, I apologize, but President Hosni Mubarak essentially passes away, and depending on where you think he goes, he arrives at the gates, and there he sees his predecessors, Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar al-Sadat, to which Anwar al-Sadat looks at him and says, what happened to you? Did you die of a heart attack, or were you assassinated? And Mubarak looks at him and says, no, I was Facebooked, So again, like I said, I'm not a big fan of calling it a Facebook revolution or a Twitter revolution, but I will certainly subscribe to the notion that one of the most important things that has happened throughout all of these revolutions is that the fear factor for ordinary Arab citizens, whether it is in the most remote village of Tunisia or the capital Cairo, was a catalyst that was fueled by information. And it was, if it weren't for Mohammed Bouazizi, and I'm sure many people here know who he is, and if people don't know who he was the fruit and vegetable seller who set himself on fire. If it weren't for his family and friends who that night went to the streets and protested and uploaded the video of that on the internet for other people in nearby villages to see, and for Al Jazeera, thousands of miles away in their studios to notice, to then put that image on and broadcast it to the 40 million or 50 million people who are watching it, other people in Tunisia would not have known that this happened. And the reason why is because they would have been watching state media, and we all know that state media would have painted rather a very beautiful picture of Tunisia. Now, I'm also a person who supports the notion that there actually is a role going forward for state media in Egypt and in other Arab countries. There's a difference between state-owned media and state-controlled media. And I think what all Arab countries have failed to do is to make that distinction. No Arab country has successfully operated a state-owned media because they've interpreted state-owned as being state-controlled. And I think this is a really fundamental problem. If we can make that distinction in Arab societies and perhaps in successive or successful Arab democracies, the notion of a state-owned media is not necessarily bad. We have, PBS in the US, we have publicly funded organizations such as NPR in the US, we have the BBC model. There's plenty of examples where state-funded media can be an important tool of educating and keeping the public informed, and I think this is what the Arab world needs to do. They haven't done it yet, but it doesn't mean that you should close the chapter on the notion that the state can provide a credible media outlet. So I look forward to a very interesting discussion with all of you, and again, thank you very much for having me here.
Well, that's very interesting. We've gone from, yes, there is a role from state media to there is no role for the state media. Let's just focus once again on the Egyptian state media. They have, Dina said, they flipped overnight. Some of them actually flipped the same day from being the I don't know, I can't find an adjective for it, but media that would suggest that the country had been flooded by Israeli spies posing as journalists hardly deserve the name of journalists themselves. But is the Egyptian change a credible change? Is it? Can you believe that all of a sudden they're dancing to a different tune, and this is because they really get it, they know what's going on, or or is this just more of the same, but dancing to different masters?
Well, thank you for the question, and I think all the points were valid points, but I still think that still too early to make judgments about where media is, where state media is right now. If you look at Al-Ahram's coverage of the detention of Mubarak and his sons, which happened yesterday, and if you read what they reported, it's like it just looks a little bit kind of almost paranoid, kind of schizophrenic, kind of. This is, you cannot really believe that they are, the way that they're talking about it, it just doesn't seem to be any kind of leadership, despite the fact that leadership in the paper, despite the fact that the editor has changed. So I think that the journalists themselves and the people who work for state media and state media themselves are still going through the process of change, what to do, how to do things. I think, the model of public service broadcasting is instructive, but it might, in my opinion, it might not fit in a situation or a context like Egypt or in the Arab context. There are different elements that are at play there. And I think it's still too early to kind of pass judgment or to say, well, this is what we have here. I think we still need some more evidence, some more research done on the changes. I mean, we can look at the transitions in democratizing nations like Eastern Europe and see what happened. The former Soviet Union, what happened to the state media? And if you think about it, the state media has kind of remained the same, following the same principles of reporting. So the question is, what model do we follow? And we shouldn't forget that we have around, I think, 46,000 people working in the case of Egypt, in the ERTU, which is the Egyptian Radio and Television Union. So what happens to these people? Do they become redundant overnight? What are the political implications for that? And I think it's the question of losing credibility or gaining credibility for a long time. And I think even during the revolutionary or the uprising process, people continued to switch to state media, but also continued, I'm talking about television. They also, and I think television remains very important because yes, Facebook and so on, but I think television remains the mass medium. Because you cannot forget that there's I can't remember what is the percentage of illiteracy in the country, but it's quite high still. So people turn to television. So people were switching channels, between state media and, let's say, Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya, and trying to see which one is telling the truth. And I think Al Jazeera played a very interesting role here, which shows, split screen, where this is what state TV is showing and this is what is actually happening. Again, adding to the discrediting of the state media, but also some people remained kind of a little bit wary of what is going on. So I think the process of credibility, the process of trust, the process of trusting media is a long process, and it doesn't happen overnight. And again, the revolution, I don't think, has finished. The process is continuing in terms of changes and so on. And I would like to add a very tiny point, which is I do not really think that we can credit social networking with everything that happened. Yes, of course, it was a tool. They were used as a tool by organizers, but there are there were other factors that made this happen. There was a tipping point when things could not go back; they had to go forward. But there were different processes that were taking place before. Again, we need more research into what was being said on these social networking sites since 2005 in the case of Egypt. What were people debating? What were they talking about? What type of politics were they, what type of criticism of government was there? And so we need to look into that.
Among these other factors are certainly the pan-Arab broadcasters and especially Al Jazeera. Hugh, how important a role do you think Al Jazeera has played in the Arab Spring that we're seeing now?
Well, I think Al Jazeera has clearly played a very important role. Although it's worth stressing that the reason there were revolutions was because of the political and economic situation in Egypt and Tunisia, and the media plays the role of an accelerant in this situation, but it does not. Media alone is not going to cause or start these revolutions. But Al Jazeera nevertheless did play a critical role really over the 15 years since it started broadcasting, informing Arabs about their civil rights, showing them how democracy works, showing them how other people are treated around the world, broadening their horizons. And this, I think, was key. It also allowed them to interrogate their own leaders and see just how rotten and corrupt all their governments were. The veneer was just stripped away from these leaders, and then during the revolution, Al Jazeera missed the boat at the start. It wasn't on the ball for the start of the Tunisian uprising. It started on social media, and then Al Jazeera cottoned on, and Al Jazeera started broadcasting the social media, and this had a big impact, a galvanizing effect on Arabs everywhere, and it certainly led to the quick spread in a matter of weeks rather than months, which is how long the revolutions took to spread at the end of the Soviet Union. In a matter of 6 to 8 weeks, the revolutions had spread across North Africa. Al Jazeera showed people demonstrating. It showed them tactics. It showed them and strategy. It showed them that they could overthrow a regime peacefully. It taught them how to avoid the security apparatus. It showed them all kinds of tips and hints about how to go ahead with this. And Al Jazeera has also helped the opposition coalesce by interviewing previously unknown leaders of the revolution. This is particularly obvious in Libya, where in Libya no one was allowed to have any profile because obviously Gaddafi was so repressive. And Al Jazeera has given Libyans, the politicians of tomorrow, the opportunity to present themselves, present policy, introduce their views, get to know one another, and this can't be underestimated. No one else is doing that. Al Jazeera has had a very substantial impact right from the get-go, and continues to now.
Basil, you.
Yes, I would like to build on both these arguments. I think editorial integrity is only to be proven. It cannot be promised. Nobody can come and say, I promise you to be, a good journalist. I like what was mentioned earlier about credibility. It will take, I don't think having, a credible state-owned media is impossible. However, the circumstances that, the examples I've mentioned, PBS or BBC, do not exist. The only way this could happen is you can have an independent board of trustees, and you have a constitutional right that is implemented to protect Al-Ahram or to protect state television, to criticize the government. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that whoever, and by the way, being anti-Mubarak when everybody else is anti-Mubarak isn't journalism. What else can you, show us a real story. So if this continues, whoever is going to come to power, then Al-Ahram is going to be playing the same role they used to do with Mubarak, but whoever is now in power. So the only way for this to work is to have an independent board of trustees and a constitutional right that is implemented, which guarantees journalists freedom of speech. It guarantees them the right to report, of course, as long as the reporting is accurate, not liable. I hear a lot of flattery to Al Jazeera, which became a big fan of recently. Al Jazeera, I think, isn't without its criticism as well. It is also state-owned, but it's also commercial. It takes advertising. whereas it's much better, I think, and way ahead what Al Ahram and State Television did. The moment I'll feel comfortable with Al Jazeera was when I see them as critical to the Qatari government as they are to other governments in the Middle East.
That's a question I'd like to raise. I don't think we should give Al Jazeera a completely free ride. Some people are saying that Al Jazeera goes hard on Egypt, but in the Gulf, Bahrain, and perhaps Syria, not quite as hard. Perhaps reflecting. I'm just quoting what other people say.
Yeah,
perhaps
of course,
reflecting Qatari politics. Is that a legitimate? It's a difficult question to ask an Al Jazeera part.
Sure, no, of course. First of all, there's always legitimate questions to ask about any news organization and their coverage, and that's what we expect from viewers to do. So there's certainly no reason to ever shy away from any questions about Al Jazeera. But I think one should look at it systematically and, more importantly, empirically. I think if we're going to do it from two different points, we have to first make a distinction between Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Jazeera English. And secondly, we have to be, more importantly, when we look at the facts behind Qatar, and then we have to look at also, as you mentioned, Bahrain and Syria. Those are all very different issues. When we talk about Qatar, again, prior to these Arab revolutions, I think that, and I can give you anecdotal evidence here, having covered things about Qatar critically. When Qatar was bidding for the Olympics, I had to do a story about Qatar's bid for the Olympics, and people came to me and said, "Oh, you're only covering it because Qatar owns Al Jazeera, and you guys have to cover Qatar because they own Al Jazeera." And then when we don't do something about Qatar, everyone comes to me and says, "Oh, you guys aren't covering Qatar because it's Al Jazeera." And in reality, there's this kind of dichotomy with how people view how Al Jazeera should cover Qatar. I will say this: I would be very hard pressed to find a story that has appeared in any major international outlet about Qatar that hasn't appeared on Al Jazeera. So, for example, human rights, labor issues, the way labor has been brought in, has been used and abused. Al Jazeera has reported on that extensively in the Gulf and particularly in Qatar. More recently, in the fact that Qatar's profile has kind of exceeded its boundaries, it has now started playing a role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with Hamas and Fatah. It has played a role in Lebanon. And you will see a lot of the people who are brought on Al Jazeera engage in debate where they express themselves critical of whether Qatar is playing a productive role or whether it's not playing a productive role. So there are some ways to look at it from that perspective, and certainly there's the other perspective, which I slightly disagree with Faisal about Al Jazeera being commercial. While yes, it does take on commercials, it is not a commercially driven product. It is not driven by generating revenue. That's never been the modus operandi of Al Jazeera compared to, let's say, CNN or perhaps slightly different Western models. And therefore, it is not the traditional classical sense of a commercial media enterprise. I don't think it's fair to call these Al Jazeera revolutions, and here I agree with you. I think calling them Al Jazeera revolutions is very disrespectful to the Arabs who have taken to the streets and fought for their own rights. I think it's really sad for anybody to try to claim that Al Jazeera was behind these revolutions. Al Jazeera did not make Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire. It did not make the people in Egypt risk their lives in Tahrir, or for the 700 or so people that have died there. I think what we can say is that in a place where state media tried to mull and suppress the voices of Arabs for decades, Al Jazeera amplified the voices of those people. And here I agree with Hugh saying that it gave a platform for people who we normally wouldn't hear from, whether it's in Libya or in other people in exile or the other people that were involved in organizing some of these events. But more importantly, these revolutions did not start in the case of Egypt on January the 25th or in the case of Libya on February 17th. In Egypt, April 6th, the Kifaya movement, other forms of opposition have been active for years in Egypt. They've been chipping away at the regime systematically for years. And the question is, and perhaps here in the future some of the researchers will ask this question, is what became the tipping point? The problems we knew, the problems of corruption were there, human rights abuses, the lack of democracy, all there, all visible to see. They were not hidden, and they're pan-Arab. They stem across the entire Arab world. No country is spared from these abuses. The question is, will every country have a slightly different pattern? What role will information play in galvanizing people to go to the streets. And here it's different. No two countries are going to be the same. The development of Bahrain is going to be different than what it was in Egypt, and the role of media will be different in each one of these countries.
By the way, does anybody here think that Egypt was a special situation because, in fact, the army was delighted to get rid of Hosni Mubarak and his son, who was the anointed Dauphin? Was that really a revolution?
Well, I think, in the academic, can I just quickly answer that? Sorry, you want to say
Go
something?
ahead, go ahead.
The debate is ongoing, and there is. It's not strictly a revolution in the real sense of a revolution, because again, if you say the army is there, there are some, the institutions have not totally changed, have not been overhauled. Yes, people who have been corrupt and in power and embezzling people and torturing them and so on, they have been brought to account. But things have not drastically changed as of yet. But it's still too early. Revolutions and changes and uprisings take time. And then the tipping point. I was in Cairo last week, and there was this taxi driver. I said, he was telling me, that it's very exciting to go there after the revolution as compared to before. And this taxi driver said, what happened is that you blow in a balloon, you blow until it explodes. And this is what happened to us. We just exploded. Of course, this is just one quote, one argument by one man. But again, it requires thinking about what's been happening before and since. But I don't want to take space time.
Ayman?
Well, I was just going to say, the thing about the Egyptian revolution, I think history will show, and perhaps when historians go back and study it, that it may have been 90% revolution and 10% military coup, or some kind of proportion thereof. And the reason why I say that is, for all of us who were in Egypt covering the revolution or the protests, if you remember, the day before Mubarak stepped down, he stepped down on Friday, February 11th. The day before, all the evidence suggested that he was actually stepping down that day. In fact, a lot of our people that we were closely in touch with had told us that some kind of deal had already been worked out with the military, that he was going to step out. And if you remember very closely, there was that Thursday afternoon a communique. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces met for the first time ever without the presence of Hosni Mubarak convening it, or the president of Egypt convening it. So there was a lot of strong evidence to suggest that at some point there was an agreement that Mubarak had to step down. But what happened was, that night he went on the air and didn't step down, and completely surprised everyone. And even the communique that was issued as communique number 1, suggesting that perhaps there had been some kind of departure from the previous way of doing business, and now we had entered a different phase. That didn't happen. 24 hours later, he stepped down. Now, what happened in those 24 hours? Did the military say to him, look, you were supposed to step down yesterday, you didn't, we're now telling you must leave? That, I think, is what history, and perhaps, in the coming years, we will learn as some of these maybe officers step down and retire and tell us really what happened. But I think that the military's neutrality from day one in both Tunisia and Egypt was critical. In countries like Syria, in countries like Bahrain, in countries like Libya, where the military has chosen not to be neutral, we have seen the consequence of it turning into bloodshed.
We have an excellent audience tonight, and I would like to turn it over to you now to give you the maximum amount of time to ask questions of our panel. You can even make a statement if you want. That's a dangerous thing to say, but that's welcome. Sir, you raised your hand first. Gentleman there by the wall.
Thank you very much. Can I ask 2 questions, hopefully both quite short? First of all, in Syria, where do the panel think that the Syrian revolution will go as far as the media is concerned? What role will the media play? And secondly, is having a free media necessarily a good thing? And I ask this by if you look at Pakistan, I can't think of a country more in dire need of a revolution, but it's free media that prevents a revolution from actually taking place.
Well, that's an interesting proposition.
I'll take that.
Okay.
Well, there is no doubt that having free media acts in normal societies as a safety valve. It's a way for frustrated people to express their views. And I think one of the issues, of course, there are many contributing factors to what happened in the Arab world, but one of, a key similarity between all these countries is none of them had a free media. And perhaps, I'm saying only perhaps, if they did, we wouldn't have saw something like we just saw happen. Now, whether or not it's actually true, I mean, I'm talking theory, and perhaps the professor could build on that, but there is no doubt, to go back to your question, that having a free media can help diffuse a situation sometimes.
Can I respond very, very quickly to the question on Syria? I mean, the state media there has been actually producing very weird propaganda. They're sending emails to people like me, telling me that this is a foreign plot. It's hatched by Al Jazeera and other people and so on. But it's interesting that these leaders, these authoritarian leaders, they all follow the same kind of process. These countries, they all did the same thing. They kind of either shut down the internet and stopped people from reporting, arrested journalists, prevented people from coming in. And then the second thing, they started talking about the foreign plots. Thirdly, they started talking about security, national security, and so on. I think Syria is a very interesting case because it's really there has been no freedom of speech of any sort, apart from kind of musalsalat, the serials and kind of comedy programs and so on, where some criticism of government has been allowed, but not a criticism that you had seen in Egypt. So in the case of Egypt, I think you mentioned a good point, Faisal, but I think in Egypt even it did have an expanding media space. There were independent media. There was private press, Al-Shuruq, Al-Masr Al-Yawm, zillions of television stations. And yet, they would crack down when they wanted to. Bloggers were put in prison. And interestingly, a blogger has been put in prison recently.
What do you think of that? Yes.
Oh, it's really
given 3 years.
Yeah, he was sentenced for 3 years because he criticized the army. Again, that comes to the question: well, has the system changed, or do we still have the same processes or the same kind of institutional frameworks in place? And this is your point about we need protection for journalists. I mean, this is so key for people to be able to speak. You need to have a union, you need to have laws to protect journalists.
Sorry. Oh, man. Sorry.
My name is Randa Ashmawi, and I work for Al Ahram Ibdo. I've been working for Al Ahram Ibdo for 17 years, and I'm trying to come in defense of Al Ahram. Before I do that, I would like to thank Ayman, because I've been in touch with you, Ayman, all through the revolution. I was reposting, tweeting, retweeting all your tweets, and you've been very, very useful in many, many different moments when I was desperate in search of information. You had really excellent first-hand information. And just to start defending Al Ahram, I would like to start by the new edition directed by my friend Hani Shukrallah, Al Ahram Online, which did an excellent job during the revolution. It did not go far behind, or no, it was at the same level of Al Masr Al-Yawm, of Shuru, and all the other publications. It was extremely reliable in terms of information, and it was not censored in 1 second. For Al Ahram, I grew up there in the past 17 years. I know Al Ahram from the inside, and I would really like to defend this traditional and very respectable institution which has gathered over the years, over history, because it was created in 1878, the best and the greatest writers in the Arab world. I mean, Al Ahram is where Salam Ahmed Salam writes, where Al Ahram is where Osama al-Ghazali, Muhammad Sid Ahmed, he worked and died for Al Ahram. So it's the house of the greatest and most progressive writers in the Arab world, and who have come up with the with avant-garde of thinking the Arab world. So we really need to respect what Al Ahram have produced over the years, and it has, in spite of the bad leadership, in spite of the total control that it has on its line by the government, putting the worst possible people in charge, like Osama Saraya and all the catastrophes that we have had in the past years. No, Al Ahram has the potential and has the people who can still be, the avant-garde of journalism in the Arab world. I really, wholeheartedly defend. Of course, now we have other publications in Egypt which are excellent, but still, Al Ahram are not behind them. It will go on doing the job that it has the potential to do whenever it will have the space to do.
Okay, I take that as a statement rather than a question, unless anybody wants to dispute it. Ma'am.
Just following up on that.
Lady in the back.
Go ahead.
Following up on this excellent point, I was a bit disturbed when you're all trying to diss the official media. Just wanted to throw the idea that maybe perhaps we can, or you can have a view on a free flow of information, which means there is room for everybody. Free flow of information would back freedom of speech, because different people will have different ideas. We just want to hear all of them, because so far we've heard only a few, or maybe one or two in each country. So maybe if the panel can maybe give me some idea whether we can perhaps support free flow of information, because people in the region are not stupid. They think, and you cannot stop them thinking. It's just they didn't have the platform to speak. So now we need to give them some more means to speak and not shut them up anymore. I think that's what I feel strongly about anyway, not shutting state media.
But isn't that the role that Al Jazeera has been playing in many ways?
Well, I would say it's the role that the social media has been playing. I mean, the whole point of the Web 2.0, these networking and these chat rooms and interactivity means that this is a revolution. Firstly, in the quality of footage that people can put together in their bedrooms with a laptop, but also a platform to. It's an extraordinary change in the number of people they can reach in terms of distribution. So it gives ordinary people a voice, and this is this is what's happening now in the media, that we're not having centralised media anymore. It's people are getting their information from Twitter and these new from new sources, and this is shaking the Arab world just as it's shaking the media in this country. But I mean, clearly the future is wide open.
I think to go to the question of the free flow of information, yes, so you have people speaking their opinion and diverse views and so on. And I think if you think about Britain as an example, you have different media and you have different spaces where you could say what you want, or where people can say what you want. But there is still the question of, regulation, which is, how do you protect that person who's saying what they want, or how do you offer protection? What are the limits of freedom of speech? You cannot incite hatred. You cannot incite. You can get to a situation where you could cause more problems by this kind of freedom of information and the flow of information without people themselves being held accountable for what they say. Sort of you have to be careful about that, I think, as well. So it's a question of, I do think that we're still at the regulation, and even regulation in terms of capital, who owns what, is also very important, because you might end up with a situation like the Murdoch situation, or controlling everything. Prince Walid controls quite a lot of the media in the Arab world. So what does that mean? Are you still having one voice, or do you have many voices? Maybe Al Jazeera will control everything. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
I thought the Saudis controlled just about everything except Al Jazeera.
Yes, well, that's why Prince Walid bin Talal, I mentioned his name.
But there is no regulation. There's no regulation. It's chaos.
It's chaos.
This is why in Arabic children's television programming you can have commercials for Red Bull. or McDonald's because there is no regulator.
Yeah, it's very, very, it can be confusing, it can be dangerous, it can be, I don't want to use the dangerous as being, threatening or anything, but it can be confusing.
I think if I can take a step back a little bit, which is the entire relationship between states and their citizens are changing in the Arab world. The social contract that's written between the governments and the people are being ripped up in some countries. It's not to say that these transitions are going to be positive. It's not going to say that it's going to be smooth. It's not even going to necessarily be successful in the long run. But I think the important thing, and this is why, the free flow of information is always good. To have pluralistic viewpoints is always good. People should not just watch Al Jazeera. People need to get their sources from as many different outlets as possible. And in this case, one of the most beautiful things is that you don't need me to bring on somebody from the Muslim Brotherhood for you to actually hear them. You can go to the Muslim Brotherhood website, watch them, sign up to their Twitter feed, go on to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces military website, sign on to their Facebook page. You'll get their press releases. You as an individual can draw your own conclusion. It's no longer just about information. That's the bottom line, is that we're sitting in this room, within seconds, if something happens, we're all going to get it 1,000,001 ways, and it's not going to be Al Jazeera that's going to deliver it to you. There's going to be 1,000,001 ways where you guys can all get this information before anything happens. What really is the difference now is the context and the analysis and the opinions and the viewpoints that you may get. And in that sense, you need to have as many viewpoints as possible if you want a society that is at least somewhat healthy and robust in the debate that takes place. So I am a supporter of saying, you know what, I don't think there has not been a successful state media. I'm not an advocate of state media. And I have great respect for Ahram, but Ahram, and even in Tunisia when I was there, I did a story about the freedom of press. They made a lot of mistakes, and there are good journalists in those buildings. But for the same reasons that 80 million people have been, suppressed for 30 years by the Mubarak regime, I can assure you that 400 employees at a newspaper can be just as easily suppressed. And that's what we have. We have systems where people are being suppressed. What's changing now is that relationship. So there's potential for Ahram to become an incredible, good, positive newspaper if the space is codified, meaning like there are laws and regulations that ensure the pluralism of news organizations and in some capacity regulate the interaction between media and the state. All of that has not happened yet. And we hope it will for the sake of journalists who risk their lives and more importantly for the consumers of news.
Thanks. Just a quick question. I'm afraid I didn't really understand. I'm Yana Kobzova, working for a think tank here in London. I'm afraid I didn't really understand the notion of Arab world not being ready, or the time is not ripe for the Arab world to introduce or adopt the similar public broadcasting service that the Western media have, or the Western countries have. Could you just explain why do you think so? I mean, having in mind especially the role that public media played in Central Europe right after the transformation, after the fall of communism. Once they were transformed into public institutions, they actually played quite a positive role. I'm thinking about Czech Republic or Poland.
I didn't say that the Arab world is not ready for public service broadcasting, but what I maybe I said that. But what I said is that I do not think that it is the actual. It can be the only model that can be adopted. There might be other models that can be developed that might suit the context much better than the public service broadcasting model. Okay, so I think it isn't like they are not ready, or it's just that I think it's too early to bring in models from outside and say, look, follow this model. I was in Egypt recently where there was a conference on democratizing media, and everybody was saying, okay, let us tell them to follow the public service broadcasting model. But it doesn't work in every context. Okay? This is my opinion, because you really have to think about the kind of the historical development of a model. That model did not develop out of nothing. It came it followed a particular route to come and be used in this country. And what I'm saying is that we need to develop the institutions all together and develop media within those institutions in a country.
I'll just add to that. I'm the one responsible. I said that the Arab world is not ready, and I stick to that. These revolutions, if they do not result in having a constitutional right for freedom of speech, for journalists to hold people in government accountable, then we've done nothing. We're going to go back to where we started. If during the Mubarak regime the media has acted as free as you said, in Europe, it would have acted as a safety valve. Mubarak wouldn't have stayed 30 years in power. Probably people who have abused power would have been put in jail. So I'm not saying it doesn't work in the Arab world, but until we have these laws, and by the way, if you read Arab constitutions, they're brilliant. Not only do you need them, have them written down, but they need to be implemented. So this is why I emphasize about having the laws and implementing them. Without them, then there's no point, because what will end up happening is the media will start, instead of doing its role as a watchdog, it will end up flattering the people in power and attacking their enemies, as as the current system is at the moment.
Yeah, hello, my name's Naomi Wimborne-Idrisi. I'm a former Reuters correspondent and now an interested observer of the scene. We've heard tonight how important social media and technologically advanced media have become in the Arab world. We've also heard how the social movements that we've seen have underlying political and economic causes, obviously. What I'm interested in, and I'm sure people on the panel can help me here, is how deep does the reach of the new technology go in those societies? There have been some comments in media reporting of the cataclysmic events, talking about an elite, the professional class, the educated people, and so on. How deep does it really go?
Yeah, you mean down on the delta, that sort of thing, or right?
Well, I think that's a very good question. The fact is there is an enormous shortage of information about this. We don't know exactly what the causal relationship was between the social media and the revolutions, and the fact is that journalists are not best placed to judge, because journalists themselves are immersed in media of all kinds. So, when journalists confidently say that the media is sweeping Egypt, well, it might be sweeping them in their newsroom with their Blackberries and so on. But the fact is that 40% of Egyptians are illiterate, I think, and they're not in the Twitterati. They're working people who are exposed to Twitter through Al Jazeera. They're exposed to the internet through Al Jazeera rebroadcasting things. But I think we have to question really the relationship between the media and the revolutions. I mean, let's not forget there's always been revolutions, and people have often managed to gather, or not often, but periodically, millions of people have gathered in cities to overthrow dictators in historic times. You don't need Twitter and Facebook to make revolutions, and it's easy to think with the wonders of communications technology that 10 years ago or 15 years ago people didn't really know what was happening in the world. Well, they did. Arabs have had BBC, Radio Monte Carlo for a generation, so anyone who was interested in hearing the news easily could. So, free media, more media doesn't necessarily mean a revolution.
Can I comment on that?
The gentleman in the back.
I just wanted to comment very briefly.
Hold your fire for a second.
I mean, I totally agree with that argument, and I really think that, and I did tell my colleagues before, is that on the 28th, which is the day when Egypt stopped, the government decided to kind of disconnect the internet and all forms of communication. Actually, people went out to the streets, and people decided that, well, we want to find out what's happening. And so it kind of moved from being cyber politics to being street politics, if we could use those words. I come from a kind of field of study where we do not want to emphasize, we actually go against emphasizing technologically deterministic argument. The medium is not the message. So I hope that kind of answers it very quickly.
Sir.
My name's Tim Goxall. Among other things, I'm from UNESCO UK, where we've got another meeting on Middle East media, which is going to be on the 3rd of May, which is World Press Freedom Day. It's the official World Press Freedom Day event, and the details of that will be coming around shortly. The question I want to ask is about, well, it's very pleasing that the meeting is not falling into the old trap of state media bad, independent media good. Not just because state media can be good, but because independent media can be so bad. These are not the first countries where a virtual state monopoly or state control of the media has given way to a free-for-all. And the experience in other countries has not been good. The obvious example is Soviet Union and the other countries of Eastern Europe, where for a couple of years in the early 1990s they had a glorious golden era of media freedom, but fell prey to other interests in society. And many people have seen in many countries where independent media, the journalists in them, just as slavishly or even more slavishly follow the interests of a political party or some big business interest. The question is how much confidence the members of the panel have that the journalistic professions in these countries would be able to maintain independent and free reporting standards if the same sort of thing happens. In other words, if there is an opening of the media, but then they come under the control of other powerful interests in society. What are the prospects in these countries, do the panel think?
Well, that's a good question. Let me make just a half an answer, if I can take advantage of my platform here. In a long career as a foreign correspondent, I found an amazing number of journalists behind what we used to call the Iron Curtain, or in what we call the Arab world, who get it, who understand, who know what's right. And there's really something to build on there. I was amazed at how open-minded they were and how democratic their principles. But that's half an answer for me.
I will answer very briefly. Do you think that journalism here is free of interests?
I think that in this country we have a couple of hundred years of free reporting tradition. We've had independent press for hundreds of years, which countries in the Middle East haven't. Incidentally, just on the chair's point, I think it's a good point, right? That in many countries you see journalists who work for state media who do actually try and work to professional standards, who argue. Editors of state media are always getting fired because they try and establish some degree of professional standards when they're under great political pressure. And these journalists, as we know, often go off and work for independent media where they become under the control of some local business magnate or something and do exactly as they're told.
Was that your experience at Al-Ahram?
Yes, somehow, unfortunately, because of the constraints. Somehow, because of the constraints, many journalists have to be through over the years. At certain points, they left Al-Ahram, and like Hani Shukrallah, for instance, he when he was obliged to lower the standards of Al-Ahram Weekly, which by the way was the channel to which Edward Said wrote, and from where all his work became, it was spread all over to the rest of the world. When he was obliged to make concessions, he left Al-Ahram for a certain time, but he returned to create Al-Ahram Online edition, which is excellent to its international standards. Yes, at a certain moment, yes, Al-Ahram, because of the constraint, because of the lack of prospects, maybe. Because it's true that only the ones who accepted to be manipulated were the ones who were promoted and became in charge, and that if you have no ambition, if you have certain ambition, you have to make concessions. If you have no ambition, you become an independent, like Mohammed Sid Ahmed, for instance. He died an independent journalist. Of course, his name was spread all over the Arab world, but he did not make concessions all through the way.
Just to answer the question, I think it's slightly less to do with having journalism culture, as you said, in the UK. I don't think there is this thing called American journalism or British journalism. I think journalism is journalism wherever it is in the world, and if it's implemented correctly, for it to be implemented correctly, you need to have the right to speak freely. Once you develop that right, and this is where the difference, to answer your question, this is the difference, as you said, here in Britain and in Egypt. Here you have this, it's almost a divine right that you can speak, you're free to speak. Once you have that in Egypt, then yes, you will develop this sort of similar culture. Again, there's always issues. There is, as the professor was saying, there's no such thing as absolute freedom. There's always commercial interest. But I truly believe in checks and balances. You have Fox, but you have CNN. You have right wing, but you have left wing. You have Al Arabiya and you have Al Jazeera.
If my choices are between Fox and CNN, we're really in trouble,
Okay. This may have been addressed already and gone over my head, so apologies if it has. Given the incredible power that's been credited to social media in particular, rightly or wrongly, are there likely to be any particular states or emerging administrations that may try and clamp down in the future even more strongly than their predecessors on social media networks?
I'll just say one thing. We were talking a little bit earlier as well about like how widely used is the internet and how widely used our social media and how integrated it is into society. And the point that I was going to say, just to make it analogous, since that argument, there's a little bit of a disconnect between those who on one hand will argue that only few people use it, but then at the same time it's not completely permeated into the society and culture, and then the question is what is the impact that it has. And if I can make it analogous, and then people say it's a tool of the revolution, if I can make it analogous to anything, it's this. If all of us are in a room and we're about to storm a building and I'm the only one with a gun and I can fire and attack that building and then all of us can storm, I'm the one with the gun. It's the only tool that I have, but all of us are going to benefit from it. And in this sense, if social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is a single tool used by a handful of elite, the end result is that that is the bullet that can break through, that opens the door for everyone else to go into it. And there's two ways to look at how social media is used from a journalistic perspective. The way we use it to obtain information and the way we use it to disseminate information. Now, in my capacity as a journalist, there have been many times where in Cairo, I'll be in my office and somebody will send me a tweet, or I'll notice on the Twitter feed or Facebook, people are preparing to storm the state security building in Cairo. And from the early hours of the morning, I could see the momentum on Twitter building up. There's like 500, 600, 10,000 people have gathered. We're going to storm the building. Now, I'm sitting in my office. I have the luxury of just waiting for this to reach like a certain critical momentum before I go. But when I go there, and I realize that people are starting to send me the pictures of the YouTube and the files, and they storm the building, and here are the pictures of the little torture dungeons and the weapons and all that stuff. I'm getting all that information. So I go down there and I get more information and I do my report and I film and I interview people. Then I turn around and I put that out on Twitter and Facebook and social media, as well as my satellite channel, and it gets disseminated to 40 million people. In this case, social media was instrumental to the exposure of this story, whether it's via Al Jazeera ultimately or not. But had it not been for social media, I would not have known about the story. I would not have gone out there to report on it. I would not then have turned around and put my report on social media for other people to pick up. So it's that bullet that can somehow work to disseminate the information. Now, that's not a catalyst for why the people went to storm the building. The people went to storm the building for one reason, but I can tell you this. The people stormed the building in Alexandria, the state security building in Alexandria, on Friday. And because they stormed it on Friday and people saw it in Cairo, they said, why don't we storm the building in Cairo on Saturday? And they stormed it on Saturday. And then people went and said, well, you know what? If they did it in Cairo on Saturday, we're going to go do it in Suez. And they did it on Sunday. And for 4 days, every state security building across Egypt was being ransacked, simply not because of the fact that these people don't hate the state security building. They hate it in every part of Egypt. The difference is that the information empowered these people, and they saw, you know what? The military did not stop them in Alexandria. They could not stop them in Cairo. They didn't stop them in Suez. And so they were mobilized, and they did. And that really is the power of information. That's why information in this particular case has been the fear factor, it has been the ability to break the fear factor for ordinary people. And it's different than, sorry if I can just say very briefly, very different than Eastern Europe, very different than Latin American revolutions. Revolutions in the past have happened in the absence of information. These are the first revolutions to happen in the information age. These are the first genuine revolutions to happen in the presence of the internet, in the presence of satellite channels. I have had many, many illiterate Egyptians come into my office in Cairo with cell phone footage saying, I don't know what it is, but here's the picture I just took while I was walking. I took a picture of these guys beating the crap out of some Egyptian peasant. And you could see clearly that they understood that what they had was something powerful. They don't need to read, they don't need to have a Twitter account, they don't have a Facebook, but because they have a cell phone that allowed them to capture this image, they came to me saying, I want to get this message out. I want to show this abuse to other people. And that's really the power of information and how it galvanizes people into action and into obtaining these values and ideals that they know, as Hugh said, exist beyond their borders.
I think the label that Ayman has put is actually accurate. It's more, as you accurately said, it's more an information revolution rather than a social media revolution. I go back to the figures I said in the very beginning. Statistically, there are 40 million people who have accessed the internet last year in the Arab world in a whole year, which is the equivalent of what Al Jazeera gets on a daily basis. Al Jazeera Arabic gets 40 million viewers a day. I strongly believe the Arab world is still very much a television-driven part of the world.
Luckily.
Yeah. And as we've heard, there are areas in Yemen and Syria that don't have network coverage on their mobile phones to have internet. And you mentioned that 40% of Egyptians are also illiterate. So I think Ayman has hit the nail on the head. It is an information revolution. There are different parts, not only social media, satellite television, newspapers, traveling. It is something that hasn't happened before, and I think the right name for it is an information revolution.
But I would like to add a point here. I don't agree with the argument that the medium is the message. It's not. I mean, yes, it is possibly, there is information, but there is a sense that people, the protesters, the people who wanted to change and so on, they framed the story as well. They told their narrative. They were given the tools to be able to frame the narrative. The narrative has always been framed by the state and by the government and people in power. And all of a sudden, there is this potential to also contribute to framing. And I think Al Jazeera played a role in that, a very important role, where it used to go down to Tahrir Square and give the microphone to people, and people would tell their story. And that is their story. This is what we want. Journalism itself changed during this period. It wasn't the journalist only who was framing the story, who was framing the event, who was telling the story in a particular frame, with a particular, what we call in journalism, an angle. What was the angle of the story? It was actually the people. And I think it wasn't only social media. They used leaflets. There was graffiti on the streets. There was artwork. There was communication, people knocking at everybody's door saying, okay, this is what's happening tomorrow. And organization and media, different media were used on different mixes of media were used on different days, depending on what had happened the day before. Okay, so I do not think we can say, well, it is, but in a sense, I really like your argument that it is information. It is, different ways of giving out that information. So it is, in a sense.
People even use their bodies. I don't know if you saw the picture. It was very funny. But there's this, during the Egyptian protest, there was a guy who was topless, and he wrote in Arabic, "Ma'lish asl al-waraq khallas," which means in English, sorry,
jokes.
Ran out of paper.
Yeah, the jokes, the humor, the songs, It's all
I
the
think
music.
This is you're absolutely right. Graffiti. I mean, I was in Egypt, and between the Friday, the January 28th, and Tuesday for the first Million Man March that they organized, there was no internet connection, and those 4 days or so, Egyptians were simply walking around door to door saying, "Come out this Tuesday. There's going to be the Million Man March." Now they saw that also on Al Jazeera, and people were getting it from neighbors, and people spray painted it, and people handing out flyers. And this is exactly why I'm saying it is information. It's that information. The fact that I see somebody spray paint on graffiti, this Tuesday is a Million Man March, this Friday is Gomat al-Rahil, whatever it is, that information is what made people say, you know what, if somebody is brazen enough to write on an Egyptian tank, Irhal ya Mubarak, or this, Tuesday is the Tuesday of departure, whatever it is, that galvanized people to go to the streets. And here, this is what's different, is that the Arab world has suffered from these problems for years. We know these problems have existed for years. What is the catalyst? I mean, I certainly defer that to the academics to study down the road when they go back and they peel away the layers of it. But I think one of the things that they will find really at the core of so many of these revolutions is the power information played in breaking that fear factor. And whether it was, and I'm making for the record here, it's not Al Jazeera exclusively, it were ordinary Egyptians who shared that information. It was the internet, it was Twitter, it was all these things.
I just want to make the point that, I mean, it's not very surprising that revolutionaries use the internet and Twitter. I mean, what do you expect them to use? You know, smoke signals? You know, this is this is what we use nowadays. This is, you know, these are young people. They're trying to, you know, they'll employ any tool to meet their end, and so naturally they're going to take the latest technology. So, you know, I don't think we should be surprised about that. And I question whether the media has had such a big effect on these revolutions, rather than, for example, the role of the army. I mean, surely the reason there have not been revolutions in Syria yet, or in Saudi Arabia, or in other countries, is simply that the army did not switch sides or stand back and continues to shoot people. And this is a far, far more important factor in whether revolutions succeed or not.
We're kind of running out of time.
Could the panel reflect on what you think the future of state media might be in the Gulf states, where you have some interesting dynamics? For example, in the UAE, which promotes itself as a media hub, and yet we've recently had cases of bloggers being detained for calling for more democracy. Basically. Full elections, etc. And then you have people bravely coming out on the streets in Bahrain and in Yemen. And Saudi bloggers have actually been really brave, and yet now there are state laws to kind of repress them. And then you have the whole ownership thing, which you touched upon, Dina. And Ayman, you were saying that, the difference between state-owned and state-controlled. And Al Jazeera is this really bold organization, but you also have Qatari newspapers complaining about censorship and not being allowed to express themselves. So I don't know, just maybe a bit more of a reflection on the Gulf states and the role of the media there.
Well, in the Gulf states, I mean, the message to surviving dictators and regimes around the Middle East, the message has been that do not let demonstrations start, because once they start, you are faced with a choice, which is either shoot people, which can make them make the situation worse, or tolerate them, in which case more and more people will lose their fear and join. So the Gulf countries have realised that what they have to do is stop people from gathering on the streets by any means necessary, and when they do, to suppress them with absolutely ruthless violence, and that's what we've seen in the Gulf area, and as a result, it doesn't look like there's going to be a revolution there shortly.
Yes. Okay. And then.
Sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, there's obviously been a lot of emphasis on the sort of Twitter-savvy generation as, playing a major part in this revolution. But I'm also wondering how quickly the old guard is kind of learning the rules of the game, and sort of been talking to some social activists and whatnot in Syria, and they've been emphasising how, in fact, the opening up of Facebook has been a tool of surveillance by the government, and so that all the dangers that are confronting social media activists now. And so I'm wondering, into the future, how might these tools be adopted as a weapon by state media in controlling people or inciting fear?
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, I think, maybe a bit too late, but a lot of Arab governments have now realized that you cannot just ignore social media. And in fact, I was on the phone with an Arab journalist today, and he was telling me that actually two journalists today were telling me that they've noticed that there's a lot of people from they refer to them as mukhabarat, which is intelligence services, on Twitter. Some of them was complaining about hate mail. So yes, they've realized. But I think what's important about social media is it gives you an equal opportunity. So it gives both sides an equal opportunity, which you don't have in state-owned or state-controlled media, which is only one voice. So I think, let both sides talk, and I strongly believe that at the end of the day, the stronger argument will win. So if this is what we call a fair fight. So yes, I mean, obviously they turned a blind eye for it a long time. They've ignored it, but now they're adapting, and they're trying to use it for their own propaganda. So you're absolutely right.
Frank Jackson World Disarmament Campaign. First of all, on public service broadcasting, I would be a little more critical of the BBC myself, and as for the divine right of freedom of speech, I think that is rather an overstatement. However, my main point I want to go to is the question of the army. armed forces are always referred to as defence. And in fact, the figures for global expenditure on military generally had just been released for 2010, $1.63 trillion globally, and every penny, every cent, every euro of that is alleged to be for defence. But in actual fact, of course, as we see, the biggest single use of the army in many cases, if not most, or even all, is actually the defence of the state machine in the particular countries, and this is what is happening. And had all these regimes not been sold the weapons by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, whose actual remit is supposed to be protection of peace and security in the world, we might not have this situation at all. But however, what I want the views of the panel about is the effect on the army. We had a previous discussion in this room about Egypt, and there was a distinction made between the leadership of the army and the rank and file soldiers. And is that also relevant? And I'd like to go into more detail, but I know you're trying to stop me. But there's a report in the...
I will stop you right here.
There's just one final sentence. No, there's a report in the paper the other day about Syrian soldiers being shot because they refused to shoot their own people, the civilians. What scope is there for actually producing a revolution in the armed forces rather than just on the streets?
But this is a very big question. It's an entirely different discourse. But if anybody wants to answer briefly.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's a big question. You would like to.
Well, let me just say very briefly, because it also touches upon the question that Hugh was talking about as to studying the role of the military. In the case of Egypt particularly, something very interesting, which is that Egypt is a country whose core military officers have not fought a war for the past, since 1973, so do the math, like 40 years or so. The vast majority of the senior to mid-level officers, not the senior brass, but the mid-level to junior level officers, have actually been trained in the West. A lot of them do get their military training in the West, whether it's in the US or in Europe. That has definitely rubbed off on the way they view the role of the military in their societies. So they were, in some sense, a very positive fact that allowed the revolution to go forward. In other countries like Syria and in Libya, where the military was not subject to that kind of training, we are seeing the kind of divisions that are taking place in the military and the fact that there is a revolution. One of the most important factors in neutralizing the Egyptian military was that the chief of staff of the Egyptian army on January the 28th was in Washington, D.C. And it's widely believed that the United States said to him, look, the bottom line is if the Egyptian military has now taken control of the streets, if you're going to open fire on the protesters, you can pretty much kiss goodbye to all the $1 billion of aids that you get. You can kiss goodbye to the fact that all your military officers come to the United States for training, and you will essentially be cast as a pariah military that now is seen as a military used against your own people, when you as a military institution have been seen historically in your own country and in the Arab world as a defender of your citizens' rights and the fact that you fought against Israel and reclaimed the territory that you lost in '67. So I think that in just very short, the role of the military in all these countries needs to be studied. The one thing that I will say is that no military power in the Arab world is strong enough to stop the winds of change, whether it's Syria, whether it's Bahrain, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether anyone. The winds of change have blown across, and it will change all these societies. The pace of change and whether or not it's violent or peaceful is still going to be determined, but it will change every country.
Pleased to hear that.
Hi, Lynn Wayhead, I'm a journalist. I just wondered whether you thought that the opening up of the media in Egypt and in Tunisia will bring about a situation similar to what we've seen in Iraq or in Lebanon. I mean, we've focused in this discussion a lot about the media we've seen in countries where there's one party and a monolithic media. That's by no means the whole of the Middle East. In Lebanon, for instance, there is a free media. In Iraq, it's the same. But what we've seen is what the gentleman was talking about before. Basically, political parties own the newspapers and they own the TV channels. And it's not like in Britain where, a newspaper might be pro-left-leaning or more right-leaning. It's a political party owns the newspaper, and so they're mouthpieces. Is that a better situation than the monolithic media we've seen? And why do you think that we haven't, in these countries where we do have a free press, seen independent media. Really, it's something else. It's lots of little dictators with their medias, and it's sort of a linked question. I mean, we've talked a lot today about how these revolutions have shown the wonderful role that Jazeera has played, but do you not think they've also exposed the fact that Jazeera really does represent the Qatari government, in the sense that they were so far behind the revolutions in Egypt and in Tunisia, but look at Bahrain and look at Syria, and it's kind of radio silence. Whereas, like, for example, Arabiya has been reporting a lot about Syria, and there are political reasons obviously behind all of that. So, yeah.
Let me answer the first part of your question. What you're seeing in Lebanon is something that is called polarization of media, whereby, as you mentioned, it could be either a businessman or a head of a political party, and basically the media channel that he or she owns is expected to report favorably when it comes to the owner, and negatively when it comes to the owner's opponents. And the solution is very easily: stop politicians from owning media.
Can I answer that? I think, Lebanon's situation is very particular, because you've got a country that is divided. It's by, the confessionalism plays a big role in Lebanon, and the media have always been, kind of part of that confessional system. And yes, you have a problem with that, because you do have various opinions, but people know what's going on. And that comes to your question about journalism cultures and about the problem of possibly, whether, what is going to happen. Is there a danger that we could have sectarianism, or we could have, very narrow-based politics coming across in some of the reporting or in some journalism? And I think that goes back to a very essential point, which is, how do we regulate media? What are the media regulations that we put in place? Who owns the media? What is going to be allowed to be said, and so on? I think, since I felt when I was in Egypt recently that there's so much information that it was kind of mind-boggling. I thought, no, I want to have a day where I don't want to read the papers, I don't want to see anything, I don't want to watch television, I don't want to do anything of this sort. I don't want to read any blog, and I don't want to use social media. There is a sense, it can be very confusing. So I think there is a need for some kind of
Yes, I just want to underline that's true, that Al Jazeera, I think, has been patchy in its coverage of the revolutions, and in countries in the Gulf closer to Qatar, Al Jazeera's coverage has not been as robust as it was of Egypt and Tunisia. And
Arabic or English?
Al Jazeera Arabic, and not Al Jazeera English. And I mean, I think particularly in Saudi Arabia, Al Jazeera Arabic's coverage of Saudi Arabia is suspiciously insufficient. There's an absence of critical voices. There's an underreporting of Saudi events, like last year when there was a murder by a Saudi prince in London. It was unreported, and although admittedly the Saudi Day of Rage was just a Facebook event, Facebook calendar event, and a flop, I think that Qatar and Saudi Arabia do have a gentleman's agreement not to investigate princes and princesses and report about them in Arabic, because they live in a very fragile and a very fragile part of the world, and they have to put their strategic interests first.
I'm afraid that the clock is telling us that our time is up. I deeply regret that I haven't been able to get to all the people who had questions. You've been a wonderful audience, and I'll ask you to thank our excellent panel.